So I haven't done a video in a while, so it's raining still, and that's usually the cue to do something. I'm reading a book which is Don Quixote, the 16th century novel, but I started it like 7 years ago, and then I think I lost the Kindle, or I think I had a Amazon tablet, a Fire tablet at the time that I used as a Kindle, same kind of principle, albeit not as good as On Your Eyes. And I lost the device, and I thought that Google wouldn't, or Amazon wouldn't return me to my page, which I obviously would have forgotten, and at the same time it was kind of a boring book. But I found out the other day that Amazon is stopping all downloads from the Kindle store and the Kindle library that you have on your account to any kind of external device. So you could you still can until the 26th, but ordinarily you could back up your books and then potentially read them on another tablet operated by another company other than Amazon. So that kind of incentivized me to get that done. And then I noticed that the old books from a previous device downloaded onto my new Kindle with the exact page numbers that I left off on. So having finished the previous book, I've started reading it again. However, it is just utterly boring. There's gems in it, and I have to finish what I read. I don't think I've ever not finished a book. I feel like that's not true, but as far as I can remember, that's not the case. So I'm restarting it. But currently, it's raining and it's that boring, and I was reading it for like 2 hours this morning that I figured I would do this to buy some time. So plans have changed slightly. I'm going to China next week for the first time in 12 years. And that's because China's, I think I've specified in another video, pretty much opened up now. Anyone can get a visa, as far as I'm aware, for the same price other than the US and Canada. And that doesn't guarantee you entry, but it's quite a nice equalizing to kind of visa scenarios. There's a lot of equity there, I guess. So they cancelled my flight. I got a really good bargain flight that I booked for Russia originally, which was £75 on Trip.com, which was Ho Chi Minh to a place called Harbin in the north, where the largest ice festival is, which is still ongoing, I believe. It's like -20 at the moment. And then I was going to cross the border to Vladivostok, but because Russia doesn't issue visas to British citizens outside their own country, I kind of just integrated that into the China trip. And then they cancelled the flight, which was great, because currently I'm in Sapa. The weather's terrible. It's been like 10 days of solid rain. In fact, I think it's the highest number of consecutive rain days I've experienced in my life. But that's fine. I came here to run anyway, and I already did 3 days of running, and it's going to hopefully brighten up in 2 days. So I would have spent 50% of the trip running, which I think is fine. But anyway, returning to the cancellation, so I got a full refund, and then I was actually able to get a full refund on all of the trains and accommodation I had booked in and around that flight, both in Vietnam and China, except one very cheap flight, which is Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh, which was like 25-30 quid. So the plan now is to cross the border by Sapa, and then I'm going to go to Chi'an, kind of some typical sites. Chi'an to see the terracotta warriors, and then Chengdu for the pandas, and there's a place called Guangwan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, exactly between the two cities, which has excuse me, I always forget the name of those sites. It's like Cappadocia in Turkey, a lot of cave dwellings essentially. I always forget the name. There's an official name. Doesn't matter. So so essentially the original trip is as it was, with the exception of the leg from Ho Chi Minh to Harbin, and then following leg to Chi'an from Harbin. So actually I profited from the cancellation, which is pretty good. So that's the plan. And then continuing on to Central Asia once again, where it's going to be freezing. And that's the one problem with this trip so far. There's always trade-offs. If you come off-season, there's less tourists. So you could say it's more authentic. And to be honest, I probably prefer it, having seen places in their peak in Southeast Asia in the middle of summer. There's so many tourists around. But the weather is really, really bad. And it's going to get worse, because I prefer the rain to the cold. And obviously Xi'an is quite far north. I think the temperature gauge for when I'm there is around 0 to 3 degrees centigrade. And then when I cross to Kashgar, it will be roughly 2.5, 3 weeks later, because I'll be going south again to Chengdu, which will brighten up a bit, and then Guangwan. But when I get to Kashgar, bordering Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan and the Tian Shan range, it's going to be, I think at night, probably negative 15, 20 on the range itself. But there's one site that I really wanted to see when I was based in Kyrgyzstan, which is, it's basically an old Silk Road, I don't know what you call it. Well, essentially it's an inn, like you'd have in, you know, medieval Europe, for carriages, for horses, you know, for tradesmen and travellers. But it goes back way further, and it's built essentially on this range plateau where these temperatures are obviously in excess of negative, double figure negatives. It's called Tashrabat, that's the name. And so I'll be passing that en route to Narin. And then aside from Narin, which I have visited before, I've plotted the trips so that I don't return to any place, virtually any place, in all of Central Asia that I haven't already, that I've already been to. So that's the plan. It's essentially to wrap up all of the places worth visiting that I haven't indeed visited prior to the occasion. So yeah, that's what's happening. Vietnam. Yeah, Vietnam's pretty good, I guess. I mean, it's not my personal cup of tea because there's so many tourists. That's what you expect from Southeast Asia now. You know, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand are on the atypical trail. You know, for a reason. That's obviously a very nice place to visit, but then gradually, as more tourists venture here, it's going to become like Thailand. So obviously Thailand has reached a plateau economically, and Thailand from now, as with any standard economic protocol, will begin to collapse economically. Likewise China, which is why they've opened the border up, because China's essentially opened the doors because they don't have a cheap enough labour market to sustain their economy because of the rising middle class. So an economy is all well and good if you have the majority of the population who are working for obviously less wages. But China's now so prosperous that you know, there's a deficit, and of course, you know, until recently they had the one-child policy, so they actually don't have the numbers to sustain their economy. So a lot of the infrastructure the Chinese government's been building for the last couple of decades is pertaining to a mass influx of expats, which they are initiating as we speak. You know, it's been literally 3 months since most of these policies were implemented by China. You know, on a transit visa, you can now visit for, a lot of people can visit 10 to 2 weeks just by transiting through the country, 10 days to 2 weeks. And then most European nationals, EU nationals, get 2 weeks on arrival, and then getting a visa, they actually reduce the visa fees. So as an example, it's slightly different in each and every country, but it's offloaded to these private processing firms, which most countries use to operate their kind of consular affairs. And it's $23 for a Chinese visa exactly in USD, and then 690,000 Vietnamese is the fee for the company. And you have to go through the company, you can't go through the embassy. It's all undertaken by these private firms, which I've discussed before, shows that there's a globalist agenda at hand, because of course it doesn't make sense for different countries to be sharing data on their citizenry while simultaneously pretending that they're enemies or not politically aligned. It's all a joke, but that's the way the world is going. So yeah, that's the plan thus far. Looking forward to China. I stopped off in Guangzhou for 5 days alongside Hong Kong and Macau earlier, a couple of months ago. So I really enjoyed it. So yeah, looking forward to that. And then yeah, looking forward to getting back to Central Asia, irrespective of the cold. I still think it's the best place in the world. It's the last frontier that has a variety of landscapes. You know, it's affordable, it's safe, it's relatively sparse in terms of population, so you don't feel encased like in a country like India or wherever. So yeah, for now it's a really good place. However, there's always a however, of course, with this globalist totalitarian agenda that's being implanted everywhere in the world. I keep up to date with some certain things, and there's a slight benefit to these big international corporations nosing into what it is you're doing, in that the algorithm will always cater to your preferences and your desires. So if you like football, you're always going to get football recommendations. Because I Google kind of interesting, or not, that sounds arrogant, but unique things, I always get these unique things recommended on the newsfeed. And one of these things was a airport in Uzbekistan, which is, I think, Namangan, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and it's in the Fergana Valley, so it borders Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And it all came from an Air Arabia promotional email, and I looked at their flight list, and I was astounded that they have over 30 flights, around 35 flights, not to quote the magic number, but around 35 flights from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh to this tiny airport in the Fergana Valley where nobody goes. And this is just one airline, so assuming Air Arabia isn't the sole airline utilising that airport, that is significant numbers. If we take a standard, what's the word I'm looking for, capacity, and we acknowledge, just like most hotels in peak season, that 70% of the plane will likely be full, especially given the flights. And clearly there's a demand, otherwise they wouldn't open the routes up. So 70% of 35 flights per day with one airline are filled with what I can assume logically are just migrant male workers from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. You know, we're talking about insane numbers of people that will be migrating to that area, to the point where it's not even a particularly big place. Most of these countries don't have large populations, very tiny populations in Central Asia. In the space of a couple of months, a sizable percentage of the entire town will be migrant men from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. So then what's the motive? And I haven't researched this. It must be the classic case, which we see everywhere, of just economic boom town. They're utilising Central Asia as the next boom spot. I mean, it's got loads of resources, it's got, an excess in space, it's well connected, it's on the Silk Road. And I've been saying for years Central Asia is the best place, and this is just one micro example of how that's clearly the case. They're obviously gearing up, like in the Gulf states, like the UAE, Qatar and Kuwait over the past 3 decades. Central Asia is gearing up with Arab money, actually. Most of the money comes, at least officially, from these Gulf states. Just like Afghanistan. Afghanistan is absolutely booming now, same thing. It's all funded by the Gulf region. And so they need this cheap labour force, and unfortunately what that's going to mean, because we live in this world which is so orientated around capital, that one of the nicest, most preserved parts of the world in many respects is about to be ruined by the 25% of the global population, which unfortunately has become, patented to wherever the new economic boom is. It's just massive importation of Indians, massive importation of Bangladeshis, massive importation of Pakistanis. Of course, with that comes the attributes, if we can call it that, though I don't want to use that word because I really feel like there's hardly any attributes in those societies. And usually it's degradation. It's and again it's imbalance because it's an entirely male population. And especially with respect to Pakistan and Bangladesh, you're going to get a lot more conservative values being implanted in what is sort of a hybrid Soviet Islamic state. Uzbekistan is officially Islamic, as is Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but they're not realistically. They're not at all. These people drink vodka, and of course you're not allowed to drink alcohol as a Muslim. But again, it's that kind of alignment to being part of the Soviet Union for so many generations. But the effect that it will have on the region can only be negative. There's no positive, there's no plus to importing migrants from these countries, from Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. There's never been a benefit, and there never will be, for the average population. The only people that benefit are the wealthy, who exploit their labour because they're paying these people less than probably $1 a day. But the actual long-term effects it has on the society in question is completely detrimental. And it's the same thing we've seen in Europe. It's the same thing we've seen in other cultures where perhaps Indians and Pakistanis aren't included. Mexico, the United States, Central Africa, and the migration southwards to Botswana, Zambia, and South Africa. South Africa being probably the most violent place on earth, alongside places like Brazil now. it's the same pattern. It's a continuous cycle that never changes. And when people travel and take an interest in these kinds of matters and have the time, of course, that's the most important thing, to promote your interest, you realise it's all the same scheme and scam that is being essentially narrated by the same cabal. It's a hegemony of people who have been in positions of authority for thousands of years, and that's all objective. These are the same lineages we see in the UK, we see them in Scandinavia, we see them in India, albeit people lose their throne. They might not be called an emperor or a king or a sultan, but then they become an oligarch. It's the same system. It's just when you change the branding, people assume that the system dissolves or changes, or there's a new, let's say, more agreeable leadership. But no, nothing ever changes. It's always the same families, thousands and thousands of years. All of them still exist to this day, and they are governing the system as they did 1,000 years ago. The only real change is the aesthetic, but the actual processes of development, if we can call it that, development, because they curb and quash human development, are identical to the practices that were displayed by these individuals 1,500 years ago, 2,500 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, in all corners of the world, same system. So we'll leave it on that before I go into a rant. And it's going to brighten up in 3 days, so that should be good.